When in Rome, the black iron prison.
Perception is reality. Perspective shapes the world around you. I'm JJ Weinberg, and this is my perspective.
Greetings and salutations. My name is JJ Weinberg. I am an artist, an activist, an alchemist, a musician, a radio show host, and I am none of these things. Remember, the things that you say, the stories that you tell, they become the frame. They become your perspective. And as I say, perception is reality. But what if our perception is an illusion? These are the questions that we ask here on the show. That's what I'm going to ask in this episode. Last episode, we asked if we're still in Rome. I kind of went off on a tangent. I think I went all around, and I'm going to try and bring it back to center. So if you want to listen to the last episode, you can go to jjweinberg.com/perspective. We'll take you to, some of my writing and the links for the YouTube playlist where you can find all the past episodes of the show. You can find me here on WVLP Sundays at noon. So you can go to WVLP.org if you're outside of the radio radius here. And I want to start again, like I always do, by thanking Voga Barnes and Denny, the underwriters for this program, thanking everyone at WVLP. And make sure you tune in. There's a lot of, especially for local ideas and local matters, there's a lot happening on WVLP. I talk about a little bit of a larger sphere, but some of the stuff that I don't touch on locally is carried by some really dynamic personalities here. And then, of course, there's some good music and everything else. So check out everybody else here on WVLP. But let's get to this idea and try and see if I can get closer to nailing what I wanted to talk about last episode. The black iron prison, Maya, illusion, questions about space and time. Philip K. Dick had this idea that we're still in Rome. Are we still in Rome? Then there's that phrase, when in Rome. Even Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. But again, I don't mean this in the cartoon way. I don't mean Roman soldiers walking around in sandals and helmets. I mean something deeper. Maybe Rome's influence, maybe the questions that Rome formed to kill not the man, because they already executed the man, but how do they execute the idea? Like V for Vendetta said, ideas are bulletproof. Behind this mask, it's flesh and blood doesn't matter. It's the idea behind the mask. That's why we can put the mask on. That's why for the Million Bob March, we can all put on blue denim and an afro. Because the idea that we're trying to articulate is bulletproof. So maybe Rome never ended. Maybe the roads changed. I said this last episode, the flags changed, the language changed, and the uniforms changed. But what if the operation and the operating system installed, if this is the Matrix, if we're living in a simulation, if this is Ready Player One, I've talked about this probably about 4 or 5 years ago on Perspective as a podcast that I was doing, just a video shorts online. And you can see some of these also, again, jjweinberg.com/perspective. You'll be able to find this where I say that we're going to come to a point in the near future here where we have these contact lenses, augmented reality. We already have it with actual glasses. Of course, we have it with virtual reality, but we have these contact lenses, right, that augment reality. And as we look around, things will change in front of our, like we'll see floating billboards. A person in front of us could just put on a whole digital avatar and they would look entirely different than what's presented to us. And when we have deep fakes and AI creating things, perceiving as reality is going to be really tough for us to get a hold of and a grasp on, because at some point we forget that we put those contact lenses in and we live inside this simulation and the code. And this is the Matrix, Neo unplugs from the Matrix. But what if we already have those contact lenses in? They didn't necessarily need to be digital technology. It's about perspective. It's about framing the way we see. And if we're asking questions that aren't even genuine in the first place, but they were purposeful misdirections for us to argue about things that don't have answers. Like, what color is a square? Last episode, I talked about this idea of asking, who is the greatest quarterback in baseball history? It's a false premise. It's a question that doesn't have an answer because it's an inane question. So maybe the greatest trick Rome ever pulled was convincing the world that it had collapsed. That old saying, maybe the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world it didn't exist. So if Rome convinced us it collapsed, if it fell, then why are we still arguing about empire? Still arguing about conquest and borders. Again, Syria, Palestina was Rome in that time of occupation of Judea, land of the Jews, and the diaspora in conquest, renaming things. Why are we still arguing about who gets to tell the story? Why are we still arguing about whose suffering counts, whose humanity counts, whose history counts, whose version of reality gets repeated until everybody calls it truth? And that was at the heart of the last episode. The empire of stories. The empire of stories. Think about that and the notion that public media, the one thing that we're supposed to have that isn't beholden to the empire of capitalism, of conquest, of more, again, the territory is not just geographic. The territory is minds, of stories, of hearts. Rome not just as a place, but Rome as a pattern. Because again, public media was supposed to be something that we have that the truth can't just be sold to the highest bidder, because it's not, the motives aren't capitalism. The motives aren't increasing profits for shareholders. But we're not talking about Rome as a place, but as a pattern, as potentially the code. Rome as a machine. Rome as the black iron prison that Philip K. Dick talked about. Rome as Maya. Time, we've talked about it here in this show, and this on Perspective. We've, if you think about quantum mechanics, quantum physicists, think about things that Einstein would say. That's, again, this place where we take things for granted. We don't ask the deeper questions about our space-time experience, about what is time. So if time can be part of this illusion, Rome can still be part of this illusion. Rome draped over reality that convinces us this is just how the world has to be. So last week I said maybe the empire didn't die. Maybe it migrated. Maybe they leave stone and become narrative. They go into the code. They go into the matrix of the mind. Maybe the empire doesn't need to own every road if it owns the story of where every road is going. So that's where we're beginning this episode of Perspective. Because if the last episode started this question, are we still in Rome? I want to try and answer some of it here now. We're only in Rome if we keep letting empire tell the story. And stories are not decoration. Stories are not extra. I'm not talking about stories as entertainment sitting off the side of real life. Stories are how human beings organize reality. That's why this show is called Perspective. That's why I say I am all of these things, but I am none of these things. Because if the organization of who you understand me to be puts limits and frames on me, then it stops being what I intend it to be. Stories tell us who we are. The stories tell us who belongs. Stories tell us who is dangerous and who is sacred, who is disposable. Stories tell us what we should love and what we should fear. So whoever controls the story controls the world we think that we're living in. And last episode and all these episodes, I'm going to talk about public media. I'm working on getting you to the Million Bob March in Washington, D.C. on October 29th at 4:51 p.m. Eastern Time. What does that mean, getting you to D.C.? Again, this is how do I get you there? If we live in a simulation, if this is a matrix, if we're living in social media and we're living online and everything is just an overlay of story and augmented reality, getting you to DC doesn't mean I need you to show up in blue denim with an afro wig. Although I would love you to be there to do that, as we showed up last year. Last year, October 29th, for Bob's birthday, showed up, gave a speech from the same steps that Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech, talking about why it was important that Mr. Rogers went to Washington in 1969 to save public media. If it weren't for Mr. Rogers, there would be no Bob Ross. There would be no Mark Kistler, the man who showed me how to draw when I was a little boy. So then there would be no J.J. Weinberg, not as an artist and probably not here talking to you. Imagination, creativity, beyond the information that public media is supposed to be able to bring us. It's these ideas about the land of make-believe. What Mr. Rogers said, yeah, maybe this corporate cartoons, maybe they're, going to the least common denominator and seeing Tom and Jerry or somebody bonking somebody over the head with a mallet is something that kids are resonating with because it makes them laugh and it does this and that. But it's really going to the alligator brain. It's going to the lowest common denominator. And sure, that stuff might take off faster and that might bring more revenue to a station than something like Reading Rainbow, than something like The Land of Make-Believe in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Maybe something like that needs a little bit more incubation time, but that's why public media matters, because if we just sell kids sugar, we're not selling them nutrition. And that's what Mr. Rogers was arguing for. And so when I gave that speech last year on October 29th for Bob's birthday, we had some Bobs there. There was only like five of us, 6 of us. We started reaching out to people, though. They see us. We made it on some news. Last year I was in the New York Times dressed up as the Varnisher, my Bob Ross meets the Punisher character. We want to accelerate that this year because we want to take this story the same way that Mr. Rogers showed up in Washington. We want to show up in Washington. And we want to get this petition, much like my Quiet Riot Shield. You'll see it in the New York Times article. It's a canvas. They say that the pen is mightier than the sword, and I'm saying that the canvas is stronger than any shield. The canvas that has been signed now, I've taken it to No Kings in Chicago. I've taken it to my Million Bob March last year in October. I've taken it to Comic-Cons and events, and all around, and people have signed it. They've put their intention on this canvas. And what I'm saying is that intention, that meaning, that belief, that's where the power is. That's where imagination is. That's where the solidarity is, that when we come to show them this canvas riot shield and we come into the metaverse with this birthday card for Bob Ross, you go to happylittlehairdos.com on October 29th at 4:51 p.m. Eastern Time to sign it. Happy birthday, Bob. I believe in PBS. Happy birthday, Bob. I believe in imagination for the next generation. I live in the land of make-believe for this. We sign it and we show it during those midterms and say, look, here's our bill. Here's the Protect Bob Station Act, the PBS-A. Here's what we want to see happen, because locally, here in Northwest Indiana, the station that I appeared on as Bob Ross last year, that Congressman Mervan was on, talking about the Million Bob March. You can see all this stuff go to my Instagram. If you're an Instagram person, go to @JJ You'll see a lot of this Bob Ross stuff there. The happy little hairdos, from parody to purpose, from meme to meaning. We're showing up, but Frank Mervan, Congressman Mervan, is talking about the Million Bob March last year on public media, on Lakeshore Public Media. Well, now it's being demoted essentially to being a repeater station. Content like that can't be covered now, not locally, because they didn't have the funds. And this is happening at scale at different places across the country. What if Rome never fell? Because these are narratives. These are things that are being told. Rome wouldn't want something like public media existing. Can you imagine Caesar? What would Caesar do? WWCD. What would Caesar do? Well, put Jesus out there as a public media correspondent, talking like Sesame Street. Jesus is Mr. Rogers. I mean, Mr. Rogers was absolutely one of the closest things that you can see on media, like Bob Ross, embracing something that you would call Christ-like. He was a Christian. Mr. Rogers, 143. Every day he would look at his weight on the scale, and he was always 143 pounds. And he said for him, those numbers meant, I love you. Mr. Rogers, gentle compassion. When I talk to you about this stuff, I'm not asking you left or right. I'm asking you to choose between an example of character for your children. Do you choose Donald Trump or do you choose Mr. Rogers? That's a pretty simple question to answer. It should be, especially if you're a person who says that you follow Christ, because that's what Mr. Rogers was doing. That was the example he was setting. Bob Ross, I call him the patron saint of paint. Jesus said, say to that mountain, move, and you can move a mountain. Now, did he mean that physically with laws of physics? I don't think so. The mountain is metaphorical, but Bob says, say to that mountain, move, and you can move a mountain with your paint. This is your world. This is your canvas. I constantly try to remind people everyone is an artist. Bob said that he believes there's an artist at the bottom of every one of us. And of course, because I constantly try to remind people, you don't have to paint or sing or write or act. Your life is a creative process. Thereby, you are an artist. You are a creative being. Viktor Frankl reminds us that a human being is a deciding being. Your humanness, which gets you closest to your godliness, is your ability to choose and decide and create. So, we need those reminders. As soon as we lose that agency, we start to lose our humanity. Bob was the patron saint of paint. Mr. Rogers in the land of make-believe was the embodiment of Christian principles. And so my question to you is, what would Caesar do to Bob Ross if not put him on a cross? What would Caesar do to Mr. Rogers if not crucify him? That's why PBS matters. That's why public media matters. Who controls the story controls the world we live in. Local media matters. To be able to tell stories like the first versions of the Million Bob March that are now on the record, they're there. You can go and see this. I did a full-length episode on air, radio or video. It's recorded. And you can see it on PBS, at least on their YouTube now. But when you can't create that content, you start to cut off the story. That's why it matters when a community loses its ability to tell its own story. That's what was happening in Rome. The people that were telling that story were Jews that were under the oppression of Rome. Jews that were being scattered in the diaspora. Judea and the land being renamed Syria Palestinia. But again, PBS, This matters. Corporate dollars are never neutral, but public media wasn't beholden to corporate dollars. Corporate interests almost always overlays with empire's interests, and not in some cartoon evil villain way, not because there's someone sitting in a dark room stroking a cat like Dr. Claw. I'll get you next time, Gadget. But because money has gravity, power has gravity, advertising has gravity, influence has gravity. And we're talking about now the social media and the influencer sphere. I did an episode again on my older version of the podcast that said something to the effect that Goebbels and Hitler would have been, what did I call them? Meme machines or something. They would have loved the meme. They would have loved social media. And so eventually the story can bend towards whoever's paying for the microphone. That's why public media is so important. That's why I want you there in this. If it's all an illusion, if it's all just, and if it's everything is social media, again, we put so much weight on criticizing the algorithm. And I've talked about this here as well. The algorithm is following our attention. Where attention flows is where the money goes. Currency, electric currency, the flow, currency as in money, currency as in the current connecting us. It goes there and it doesn't care about the quality of the message. It only cares about the attention. And if the message is, like again, go back to Mr. Rogers, if the message is smack somebody over the head with a mallet, and then someone comes back over the top, why'd you smack somebody over the head with a mallet? And then they start arguing and going, and they're being influenced by their alligator brain, flight or fight. It's just like flight or fight is moving them, their adrenaline, their dopamine. And Mr. Rogers is saying, we can't afford to just go into those conversations. It's important. So show up. Please be a part of the Million Bob March. Mark your calendar. Put it in right now that you need to be there on October 29th. Imagine it's a surprise birthday party for Bob. So you have to be there at the exact right time. 4:51 p.m. is when we're going to say, surprise, we need you there. If you want to come to DC, that'd be amazing. If you want to organize a little party, a Sesame Street, Bob Ross, Mr. Rogers party at home or in your hometown, your local place, and have everybody get online to send their message at the same time, amazing. But at the very least, show up, like, comment, and share. And what we're going to do is feed the algorithm the joy of protesting. Feed it something positive, and it will respond. It will respond to the attention that we give it. And there will be detractors. They will come on and they'll say nasty things. Even though it's Bob's birthday card, they're going to come on and sign it with some nasty things. We need to show that we're there to outweigh that. So, in truth, with public media, we need a place that doesn't have to perform well, though, on the algorithm. We need something that doesn't need the algorithm before it's allowed to matter. As an artist, as a creative, that's something that's challenged me deeply, because a lot of the things I do, I feel like they matter. I feel like they're rich with metaphor, with meaning, with purpose, with clarity and parody, with humor and with insight. But if it doesn't perform well for the algorithm, it's in a vacuum. It's if Einstein is in a cornfield writing out the theory of relativity, it doesn't matter if nobody knows. And so that's another reason why public media, even just existentially, matters to me, not just because Mark Kistler taught me how to draw, but because what Mr. Rogers was advocating for was a space where we can bring attention to things that aren't just poking people in the eye. And I know that's the thing. I have too much. There's something about where I operate, where I have, I don't want to say integrity, but I guess that's what it is. My character doesn't allow me to do certain things that I know would invoke a response, a toxic response. But then that toxic response would get me attention for my message. But I always try to dance the line of actually telling the message instead of just offending people. But I know for certain there are things that I could do on the internet with my art, with my creativity, to only offend people and to do it on purpose. And with some of the work that I have in hand right now. And it would set off a firestorm, which would turn on the algorithm, which would bring more attention to me. But there's something in me that just, I can't be that person. I can't be disingenuous to what I'm trying to actually, the conversations I'm actually trying to create. So we need places where curiosity can exist without being immediately monetized. We need places where truth doesn't have to perform in the algorithm. We need places where Mr. Rogers can look into a camera and gently speak to a child without having to sell that child anything. He doesn't have to sell them a toy or, cereal. We need places where Bob Ross can paint a tree and remind people that there are no mistakes, just happy accidents, without a sponsor turning the tree into a commercial. And of course, that's what Bob Ross's business partners wound up doing. And that's a whole nother avenue to go down. But we need places where the story isn't owned by Caesar. So that's what this is about. That's why the Million Bob March matters. And that's why last year I was trying to get so many people with me to the National Mall. And I didn't think they can be with me at the National Mall in the way that we appear anyway, which is just on the internet, in the simulation, in the algorithm, in the matrix. Just show up to a post. October 29th, 4:51 p.m. Eastern Time. Bookmark it. HappyLittleHairdos.com. That's where people need to show up. Come to the march if you can, but show up there, because if we're living inside the Black Iron Prison, if we're living inside the matrix, if we're living inside the illusion, if time is not what we think it is, if Rome never ended, and if the greatest trick Rome ever pulled was convincing us that empire was gone, then maybe the way out is not by pretending we're outside the machine. Maybe it's by using the machine against itself. Maybe we unplug from the matrix right here in the digital landscape. That's how we step into the Bobberverse. Like this whole thing, if you look at Happy Little Hairdos, you can see 2014, I did an illustration of Bob and his big fro filling out the frame, going off the page. And I was like, wow, yeah, that's it. We all know Bob because of his fro. But it was a question that just entered my mind. I don't know where it came from. The notion that Bob is this gentle guy, that he influenced me as a kid, of course, all that stuff, creativity, imagination, that he's so relevant still. He was relevant in 2014, still as a meme, still out there. And I said, yeah, but we recognize Bob because of his fro. But what if he had a mohawk? Or what if he had cornrows? And so that question came and I was like, wow, that's a different timeline. And then there's a question of masks, the masks that we wear. At the beginning of the show, I say, I'm all these things, I'm none of these things. I am an artist with an afro. Just imagine what that brings to mind. Automatically, you see Bob Ross. But the frame, what if I didn't have it? What if Bob didn't have the fro? I don't think, as gentle as he was, as great as he was, his message was super clear. It's the combination of all those things. And the reason Bob had his fro was a happy accident. He's living the cliche starving artist reality. And he says, I'm going to save some money on haircuts and I'm just going to get a perm. And it's cheaper and will last longer and get me less haircuts so I can save a little bit of money. that decision, his actual starving artistness is what brought him to being one of the most successful living artists of all human history. Like Bob was a millionaire, but he didn't wear it that way because he wore his kindness, his gentleness. And it wasn't because he was selling paintings. It was because the brand was selling. And so therein lies, again, not to completely disparage his business partners because they were part of why we know Bob, but it's just about what they did, the greed and the avarice after Bob was ready to shake this mortal coil, after he lost his fro, after he had to, lose all of that hair. He got outside of his prison. His prison was his fro, became his brand. He wasn't allowed to change his hairstyle. But once he got the cancer that he couldn't beat, he lost his hair because of the chemo. And so he had to wear a wig. So when we put on the Afro wig at the Million Bob March, we're putting on Bob's crown. We're wearing Bob's crown. And again, it's funny, one of the first hairdos that I drew on Bob after I had that vision, what if he didn't have a fro? One of the first ones I drew, there were two that I drew in 2014, 2015. The first one, the idea was I keep Bob's face the same. Keep his face exactly the same and just change his hair and say, what does this mean? Who does he become then? So one of the first things I did, it was late 2015, and I drew the Make America Paint Again hat on Bob, a red hat. It was before Trump even won the nomination, I think, for the Republican Party. But I just saw the contrast immediately. I was like, wait a second. No. I don't like the tone of this. Not in the politics, like just the nastiness. And this is before Trump is even going against the so-called left. He's fighting amongst his own group, calling names and being nasty. And I'm like, this is a contrast in tone to Bob Ross, to Mr. Rogers. Immediately, I was like, we got to make America paint again. We got to make America paint again. Keep, the notion of moving the Overton window backwards is disgusting for its own reasons. But the main thing is, let's bring us back to imagination and happy accidents. And then the second one that I drew, or maybe it was even before that, I think it was before that, it was sometime in 2014, I drew long hair on Bob. Immediately, if I just drew the long flowing hair, I already had the archetype of Jesus in front of me. What we see. And again, those are caricatures, and all the caricatures of Jesus aside, being where he was at and would have been living in Judea, and what his skin tone and his hair would have looked like, all of those things. Aside from that, we still have a version that is recognizable of what we think this, caricature looks like. And there in front of me, I put a crown of thorns on him. And now he was Jesus. And I'm like, yeah, he's the patron saint of paint. He says, move a mountain. Jesus says, move a mountain. It's just about understanding the meaning. But we put on this Afro wig and we put on Bob's crown. We become Bob. I've got my hair right now. It's really long, right? And it got long because of the same reason. I wasn't even conscious of it at the beginning. I skipped a haircut or two just because I was trying to save some money. Not because I was trying to be like Bob. I just was like, I can't afford a haircut right now with XYZ. Cliche, starving artist. I skipped one and I skipped another and I was like, this is long. I like it. It's kind of like, let me grow it long again. Let me grow it long like I did in 2008 when I got arrested for singing a protest song on the top of a gas station protesting fossil fuel. Not the price of gas, which was easy for anyone to protest, but the cost, socio-politically, environmentally, of dependency on fossil fuel. Then I rode a bike. Where'd I ride a bike? I rode a bicycle from Valparaiso, Indiana to Washington, D.C., the same place I would wind up years later as Bob Ross. To the same steps, I rode a bicycle in 2008 to punctuate my protest, my meaning, to give the meme of me on top of the gas station, meaning I rode a bicycle to Washington, D.C. And then years later, I would show up there for the Million Bob March last year and give a little speech from the same place that Dr. King, the same place that I rode my bike to. And what I'm saying is we put on the crown. We put on a hairstyle. We put on this bob, and we are putting on the mask that V for Vendetta says there's an idea behind this mask, and ideas are bulletproof. And I have my hair long now. And it started because of the same reason unconsciously that Bob's hair started growing. And now when you look at me with my long hair and my beard, I become, again, that same caricature of the illustration I drew of Bob as the patron saint of paint. And people will say that. Oh, look at that. That's what I look like. But once I cut my hair, it changes everything. Simply a haircut. But so one of the projects, part of the project I'm doing this year is that after I cut my hair, I've now grown it out for a purpose. It's actually becoming medium. It's becoming part of my art. The decisions we make, our life is our canvas. The decisions we make are the brushstrokes on the canvas of our life stretched upon the bar of time that we have here, right? And our masterpiece is our life lived. And so for almost 3 years of hair growth, it's me creating simultaneously through deliberate decisions of not cutting my hair, to then use it as a medium for a piece where I'm going to take a bald Bob. As we know, the end of his days, he had lost all of his hair for the cancer treatments, for the lymphoma. And I'm going to give Bob his fro back, but with my hair. My friend Laura, she's an amazing felting artist, just absolutely incredible. I tell her she's Roberta Ross. She's got the demeanor and the spirit and the talent and the humbleness to be the joy of felting, to be Roberta Ross in some way. Laura is, again, she's amazing at what she does. And this goes right back again to the importance of public media. I had sketched out the idea of doing a pilot program of the joy of felting. Let's get her started showing people how they can do this felting the same way that Bob did. Anybody can do it. Step up to it. And now the original idea was that we would try and do that and shoot that here locally at Lakeshore Public Media, but that window is closed unless we open it again. That's why I need you at the Million Bob March. And it's still overlaying this question. What would Caesar do? Why would Caesar cut Bob's hair? But listen, I'm cutting my hair. We're going to put it on. Laura's going to actually felt it onto the bald Bob, and I'm giving Bob back his crown. But it's my medium, my hair, my life being sewn onto it. And then we're going to use that piece to raise money for Locks for Love. That's the intention I have with this piece. And of course, it will be a part of the Million Bob March story and the algorithm and the social media and this whole idea of what they call tactical frivolity. Now, last year, 4th of July, it would have been the 30-year anniversary of Bob passing on the 4th of July. I did a solo protest as Bob in front of Trump Tower in Chicago. And I was kicking off all of the stuff I wanted to do for the Million Bob March in 2025. So I knew from there I wanted to organize Bob Mobs. We did a Bob Mob in September where we all met at the Art Institute in Chicago. We had a Mr. Rogers. We had a Big Bird in full costume and a bunch of Bobs. I had protest canvas signs that I painted. Make America Paint Again, Bob Ross vibes only. And they carried their protest signs, but their protest signs were canvas. Something that they could take home as a piece of artwork. This will be happening again, of course, at all the Bob Mobs that I organized this year. And of course, at the Million Bob March. But you're taking your canvas, your protest sign home. It's more than just cardboard or a poster board with black Sharpie marker. It's art. The joy of protesting is theater and art. And this is what I'd planned. I did the first baptismal, if you will. I baptized the statue. Again, I was there with Becky. She was really campaign managing and helping me do a lot of stuff. She got some videos and pictures of me doing this right across the river from Trump Tower. I baptized the Cup statue. The Cup was a writer for the Chicago Sun-Times. And basically, I'm opening a portal. I'm bringing art. I'm bringing this idea of Fromoville, the Bobberverse, the digital landscape. Fromoville, just real quickly, if you go to fromoville.com, you have to have a legitimate computer to really be able to get on, because it's a taxing, heavy space. But you can literally walk through my imagination. My friend Benny and I created this full metaverse. It's a little town of Fromoville that you can walk through and see paintings and imagination and creativity and the happy little hairdos and the Jupiter stone and the battle for imagination and creativity between the Afronauts and the Killer Kowalski. All of this happens from within Fromoville. Even my dog, Francis, I've talked about it here so many times. My book in 2022, Serendipity According to Francis. My dog is the first dog buried in the digital dust of the metaverse. I have a little totem for her there, her picture. It's a dedication and a tribute, and her headstone is in Fromoville. But all that said, I see our Earth, our timeline, as a way that I open up and break through the illusion with parody and turn it to purpose. This humor, this meme becomes rich with meaning. And so I baptize a statue across from Trump Tower, and it looks like he's pointing right at Trump Tower. And he's got that afro and wears a necklace that says no PBS, no Bob. No Bob, no JJ Weinberg. And so then we do this Bob Mob where we know we're going to march up Michigan Avenue. The joy of protesting. People are loving it, smiling, laughing, kids wanting to take pictures with Big Bird and with the Bobs, and everybody loving it. And we had about 30 people. I mean, we should be having 300 or 3,000 people this year. HappyLittleHairdos.com. Go sign up. Send me a message if you want to be a part of this, okay? But I created this massive afro to put on one of the lions in front of the Art Institute. We had to do it in a real guerrilla fashion, covert. We had to get it done, and it was amazing. It's one of the finest accomplishments of my artistic career to this point. This fro, it looks like it's patinaed. It looks like it matches the lion specific. So it's brilliant. You can see it again on my Instagram at JJ Weinberg. I don't know for sure if I have it on the website, but I will soon. JJWeinberg.com, HappyLittleHairdos.com. They all kind of link together. You can find the pathways. But the thing is, I'm opening a portal. I'm opening a portal to the Bobberverse. I'm overlaying imagination and creativity, because that's what it is. Perspective is reality. We can change this world with our stories. We do, and we have already. So October 29th, Bob's birthday, you have to be there for the surprise birthday party. Maybe we sign Bob's birthday card on HappyLittleHairdos.com. It's really important that you're there at 4:51 p.m. because it's a surprise party. You got to be there at that time. Mark your calendars. But we sign Bob's birthday card. We make it a petition out of joy, a protest out of kindness. We make a march out of art. Like I said, tactical frivolity, I didn't even know that was a thing. I've been doing tactical frivolity since 2008 when I got arrested for climbing on top of the roof of a gas station. That was a part of where I found some harmony in that thing I was talking about earlier. You know, doing a little bit of something controversial to get into the zeitgeist, to get into the culture, to break through the algorithm, but yet it's still aligned ethically and morally for what I was trying to say. But so we open a portal. We make a march out of the art, the joy of protesting. And so I'm doing that all last year from 4th of July on. And then I start to see, I think it was the frogs in Portland. And I see, T-Rex inflatables and all these different things. And then they say it's tactical frivolity. I'm like, okay, cool. That's what I've been doing. Amazing. So then I go to the No Kings protest in October of 2025. I think it was October 18th. And I show up as the Varnisher. My Ross play. Not to be confused with cosplay, Ross play. And the funny thing is, I think the whole Happy Little Hairdos universe, the idea that there are more than 10,000 Bobs going down different timelines, different choices, the notion that simply one decision can change an entire timeline. And there's 10,000, 20,000 Bobs in the Bobiverse with different hairstyles and different looks and all these things. They're Ross playing. But the Ross play is me as the Varnisher, as Bob Ross. So it's me as Bob Ross as the Varnisher. I've got the riot gear on. I've got my quiet riot shield. People are going to sign it. And then the next thing you know, I appear as the Varnisher in a New York Times article on tactical frivolity, as they call it. So that's what I know this can roll into, because I know how stories work. You know how stories work. We can make a million small acts of meaning become visible in this metaverse, on the internet. That's what we see. That's what virality is. The Million Bob March, it's not a gimmick. It's not just a metaverse event. It's not just a birthday card. It's a piece of artwork. It's a public statement. It's a petition. It's a digital march. It's a way of saying that we still believe that stories matter. We believe that public media matters, and kindness matters, imagination matters. We still believe that not everything sacred should be swallowed by corporate money and spit out as content. That's why I need real people to show up. Because the reality is detractors will show up, negative people will show up, people who want to sneer at kindness will show up, people who think everything sincere is stupid will show up, people who have the audacity to sign Bob's birthday card with something nasty will definitely show up. So will you show up? That's the question. I need people who actually care to show up in larger numbers. People who grew up with Bob Ross. Will the people who grew up with Mr. Rogers show up? Will people who understand what PBS meant show up? And it comes back to this question. What would Caesar do? Caesar doesn't want us to show up. Caesar wants to put Bob Ross on a cross. And I don't say that in sacrilege. I'm saying it to understand that's what, empire does. So will the people who still believe that a soft voice like Bob Ross's or Mr. Rogers can be more powerful than a screaming empire? HappyLittleHairdos.com. Look at the work. You can see the canvases, all this stuff. Step into the Bobiverse. But most importantly, tell your friends and family. October 29th, 4:51 p.m. Eastern Time. Show up to HappyLittleHairdos.com. Put your voice into this artwork, because as we roll into the midterms, this visible record will show that people still care about public media, because they're trying to erase that. That's what I'm saying. They will erase the storyline. Empire knows how to fight. They fight outrage. They know how to fight with political slogans, left versus right, red versus blue. But what does empire do with sincerity? What does it do with tenderness, with joy? What will it do with the million people saying, no, you don't get to take this story too. You don't get to turn every soft thing into weakness. That's, again, what they did with Jesus. You don't get to turn every public good into a private profit machine. You don't get to erase the spaces where people learned to imagine. And Bob Ross wasn't just painting trees. Mr. Rogers wasn't just changing his shoes or his sweaters. PBS wasn't just background noise. They're portals. These are teachers. These are rituals. These are stories that help people become human. And if Rome is still here, if empire is still here, if the Black Iron Prison is still here, then we don't escape by waiting for permission. We escape by remembering. We escape by making meme into meaning, by using that algorithm, the parody, and turning it into purpose. We escape by gathering. We escape by telling a better story. So yes, are we still in Rome? Maybe. But we're opening a door in the metaverse. We're painting it. We're singing it. We're signing it. Everybody's invited in. Show up to the Million Bob March. Tell your friends. Because the empire of stories only wins when we forget that we can tell stories too. So the question about why is all this relevant is because we're letting ancient texts still frame contemporary issues. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we make when we approach ancient texts is that we approach them as if they were written yesterday. And even when last episode, we talked about even stuff that happened yesterday with mass media and the ability to communicate and cameras in everybody's hands and everybody's phones, we still can't agree on what happened yesterday. But so if we approach ancient, texts as if they were newspapers, we approach them as if they're court transcripts. We approach them as if somebody was standing there with their camera phone, recording events and uploading them to Facebook. But that's not the world that these stories came from. Most people couldn't read. Like 95% probably or more. I don't know what the numbers are. I'm being somewhat hyperbolic, but they were illiterate. Most people couldn't write. Information moved slowly. Stories were carried through memory. And the stories and the memory, the collective memory at that time, if we're talking about Jesus specifically, was Jewish. It was Judea. It was a story of oppression for that specific people. They were carried through ritual, through repetition, through oral tradition. Oral tradition is so huge for where this came from. And if you're carrying something important across generations in a largely illiterate society, you can't carry it with a spreadsheet. You can't carry it with a Google Notes or a Google Sheets. You don't carry it with a fact check. You carry it with a story. And that's why I think we've been asking the wrong questions. We've spent centuries arguing about whether Jesus literally walked on water, whether he literally moved a stone, whether he literally raised the dead, whether he literally came back from the grave. And meanwhile, we've ignored the possibility that the story itself is trying to carry something much larger than the event. The event and the magnitude of the event is meant to frame Jesus and the mission and the vision of love and compassion. Mr. Rogers' kind of love, the thing that would get to Mr. Rogers, is trying to carry that without media into generations. So we argue over whether a blind man physically regains sight. And we do that from modernity, we argue that, and we have to make ourselves, we are framing an impossible question. We're framing a question that makes us look silly, and then we don't want to answer it. Or we have to answer it by faith. But we never ask what it means to be blind in the first place. We argue over whether a storm was physically calmed, but we never ask what it means to calm the storm inside of ourselves. Jesus walked on water, so it's a miracle. Well, Peter walked on water too. We forget that part. But again, that's because maybe the water was Jesus calming the tempest of the anxiety. But it's like, well, if we just say that Jesus eased our minds and inspired us, it's not enough to carry him through the oral tradition. But we argue over whether resurrection happened in the tomb. While arguing that, we ignore the possibility that resurrection is happening every time an idea survives death of the person who carried it. Again, V says ideas are bulletproof. Rome put Jesus on a cross to kill him. And they said, well, guess what? The idea was bulletproof. When Jesus speaks, he's almost never speaking in journalism. Even what we have quoted, he speaks in parables. He speaks in symbols. He speaks in stories. He speaks about mustard seeds and vineyards and pearls and shepherds and lost sons. Nobody hears the parable of the mustard seed and thinks that they're literally a seed. Nobody hears that faith can move a mountain and imagines physically pushing a mountain into the ocean. We instinctively understand that those stories point beyond themselves. Yet somehow, when we get to the larger stories, we suddenly lose that ability and begin demanding that we read everything literally. We become obsessed with facts and miss the meaning, and then we have to ask ourselves ridiculous questions from a modern frame, and then we're meant to be believers only if we believe that these things happened in this way. We become obsessed with mechanics and miss the purpose. And that's where Rome enters the picture again. If stories carry meaning, then stories also carry power. So whoever controls the story controls the meaning. Whoever controls the meaning controls the people. And that's why motive matters. That's the part nobody wants to talk about. It's one thing for a story to drift accidentally over generations. That would naturally happen. Part of it has to happen. We all understand the game of telephone. We understand that people can misremember. We understand that translation is imperfect, especially when you talk about Messiah to Christ. It's not a translation that makes any sense. But there's another possibility that exists in every age, including our own. Sometimes stories don't change because of mistakes, not happy accidents. Sometimes they change because somebody benefits from changing them. Today, we understand that immediately. Fox, CNN, whichever way you believe, we understand that media corporations have motives. We understand that politicians have motives. We understand that governments have motives. We understand that advertisers have motives. Social media, algorithms, all motives. We understand that people shape narratives because narratives create power. Yet when we look backward into history, we suddenly become strangely naive. We imagine that nobody had motives then. We imagine that institutions couldn't possibly have manipulated narratives in that time. We imagine that empires never shape stories. Why? Human nature didn't begin in the 20th century. Human nature didn't begin with cable news. Human nature didn't begin with Facebook. If people manipulate stories now, they absolutely manipulated stories then. Noah's Ark. Think about that. I don't think these stories survived because people were trying to preserve engineering diagrams. They survived because they were trying to preserve wisdom. The ark isn't important because it's a boat. The ark is important because it carries something through a flood. Every generation faces a flood. Sometimes it's violence, empire, greed, tribalism, hatred. The question is always the same. How do we persevere? What do we preserve? What do we carry forward? What survives the flood? Maybe that's exactly what was happening with Jesus. Imagine somebody appearing in the middle of occupation, violence, empire, and saying that love is stronger than fear, that forgiveness is stronger than revenge, that kingdom is within you, that the least among you matter, that your enemies are still human beings. How do you carry a message like that through generations when most people can't read? How do you communicate the importance of that person? You tell stories worthy of significance of the message. You build an ark around the idea so it survives the flood of time. But then comes the danger. The danger is not the story. The danger is forgetting what the story was carrying. The danger is when later generations inherit the ark and become obsessed with the wood while forgetting the cargo. The danger is when institutions inherit the story and begin shaping it for their own purposes. The danger is when empire gains possession of the ark. That's the question I keep coming back to. Not whether Rome ended, not whether Rome collapsed, not whether Rome survived politically. The question is whether empire learned that controlling stories is more powerful than controlling territory, that killing Jesus didn't matter because the idea survived. So now we have to do something with the idea. Maybe that's why Philip K. Dick imagined the Black Iron Prison and why George Orwell worried about language. Why Viktor Frankl said that meaning was the last freedom that could ever be taken away. They all understood the same thing. The battlefield is not the land. The final battlefield is interpretation. It's the mind. That's why I begin every episode refusing to be trapped inside a label. I'm all of these things. I'm none of these things. Because the moment somebody successfully frames you, they build a prison around you. The moment somebody convinces you that you're only your tribe or your ideology, the walls go up. That's the Black Iron Prison. That's the Matrix. That's the illusion. That's Rome.
When in Rome, the Black Iron Prison.
Perception is reality. Perspective shapes the world around you. I'm JJ Weinberg. This is my perspective.